Well, greetings. Welcome to the dividing line. You really can't see those the batteries. I need a new battery. He's still doing all right, but I need to get in there and change the battery on my Tribble. I don't think real Tribbles needed batteries, at least according to because this one doesn't, but it doesn't really do anything. But anyway, you can see the Tribbles are still sitting on top of the Borg cube. They have not yet been assimilated. Neither has the straw man, who's... what would he look like as a Borg is really the question. I'm not sure. Don't think they ever thought about that particular storyline. Lots to get to today on the program. Got a bunch of books laid out here and stuff. And, people have complained that it's been a while since we had story time with Uncle Jimmy. But the problem was, the story time with Uncle Jimmy was heresy. I was reading Gnostic Gospels, which, so I'm not sure if we should call that this, because this isn't heresy. This is good stuff. People in channel are confused because they were talking about Jory Micah, and then they started talking about Tribbles, and some people got confused as to whether Jory Micah is a Tribble, or something along those lines. We could make some connections there, but it might be it might not be that good of an idea. Anyway, I just decided we start off today with reading something worthwhile. That it's weird. I just realized. I remember exactly where I was sitting the first time I read these words. For some reason, my daughter thinks she needs to take over the program today. Either that or be a guest. Be a guest. Well, if you ever want the B team, she's evidently wants to be on the program. Honey, you have your own. and everybody who listens to this program knows you have your own. It just doesn't last as long. I mean, a 3-hour Sheologians episode. I was going to say it would be epic, but I'm not sure that's the right term, because I just don't think the format would work real well for 3 hours like we did last time. This isn't going to be 3 hours either. But anyway, obviously extremely easily distracted today between Twitter and the channel and stuff. But I need to get better at this. I remember exactly where I was the first time, and I'm pretty certain it was this. Yeah, it was this book itself. Even though what I did is years and years ago, I've told you before. No, I guess it's in the other room. Yeah, it's in the other room. I have an uber super duper edition of the Institutes. And I mean, hardbound leather, big thing. But I knew this fellow who is a bookbinder, and so I had him take the 2 volumes of Calvin's Institutes and put them into one volume, and he did a really good job on it. But I remember exactly where I was when I first read these words. No longer exists. The building was torn down a long time ago over off of 16th Street in Camelback. But I remember what my office looked like, which direction I was facing. Really strange how I can open up a browser window today and 3 seconds later I have no idea why I opened it, but I can remember stuff like this. But anyway, read a little something for you here that certainly was very useful for me, and maybe it'll be useful for you. Oh, see, there's people already on the on Twitter going, link to your daughter's podcast, question mark. You're making her point for her now. She said, you came on my show and it was super cute. Let's cute the DL. Anyway, this is right at the beginning of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which the initial version of which was written when Calvin was less than 30 years of age. Nearly all the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts, knowledge of God and of ourselves. But while joined by many bonds, which one precedes and brings forth the other is not easy to discern. In the first place, no one can look upon himself without immediately turning his thoughts to the contemplation of God in whom he lives and moves. For quite clearly, the mighty gifts with which we are endowed are hardly from ourselves. Indeed, our very being is nothing but subsistence in the one God. Then, by these benefits, shed like dew from heaven upon us, we are led as by rivulets to the spring itself. Indeed, our very poverty better discloses the infinitude of benefits reposing in God. The miserable ruin into which the rebellion of the first man cast us especially compels us to look upward. Thus, not only will we, in fasting and hungering, seek thence what we lack, but in being aroused by fear, we shall learn humility. For as a veritable world of miseries is to be found in mankind, and we are thereby despoiled of divine raiment, our shameful nakedness exposes a teeming horde of infamies. Each of us must, then, be so stung by the consciousness of his own unhappiness as to attain at least some knowledge of God. Thus, from the feeling of our own ignorance, vanity, poverty, infirmity, and what is more, depravity and corruption, we recognize that the true light of wisdom, sound virtue, full abundance of every good, and purity of righteousness rest in the Lord alone. To this extent, we are prompted by our own ills to contemplate the good things of God, and we cannot seriously aspire to Him before we begin to become displeased with ourselves. For what man in all the world would not gladly remain as he is? What man does not remain as he is, so long as he does not know himself? That is, while content with his own gifts and either ignorant or unmindful of his own misery. Accordingly, the knowledge of ourselves not only arouses us to seek God, but also, as it were, leads us by the hand to find Him. Again, it is certain that man never achieves a clear knowledge of himself unless he has first looked upon God's face and then descends from contemplating Him to scrutinize himself. If we always seem to ourselves righteous and upright and wise and holy, this pride is innate in all of us. Unless by clear proofs we stand convinced of our own unrighteousness, foulness, folly, and impurity. Moreover, we are not thus convinced if we look merely to ourselves, and not also to the Lord, who is the sole standard by which this judgment must be measured. For because all of us are inclined by nature to hypocrisy, a kind of empty image of righteousness in place of righteousness itself abundantly satisfies us, and because nothing appears within or around us that has not been contaminated by great immorality, what is a little less vile pleases us as a thing most pure, so long as we confine our minds within the limits of human corruption. Just so, and I remember reading this over and over again and thinking about it. Just so, an eye to which nothing is shown but black objects judges something dirty white or even rather darkly modeled to be whiteness itself. Indeed, we can discern still more clearly from the bodily senses how much we are deluded in estimating the powers of the soul. For if in broad daylight we either look down upon the ground or survey whatever meets our view round about, we seem to ourselves endowed with the strongest and keenest sight. Yet when we look up to the sun and gaze straight at it, that power of sight, which was particularly strong on earth, is at once blunted and confused by a great brilliance. And thus we are compelled to admit that our keenness in looking upon things earthly is sheer dullness when it comes to the sun. So it happens in estimating our spiritual goods. As long as we do not look beyond the earth, being quite content with our own righteousness, wisdom, and virtue, we flatter ourselves most sweetly and fancy ourselves all but demigods. Suppose we but once begin to raise our thoughts to God, and to ponder His nature, and how completely perfect are His righteousness, wisdom, and power, the straight edge to which we must be shaped. Then what masquerading earlier as righteousness was pleasing in us will soon grow filthy in its consummate wickedness. What wonderfully impressed us under the name of wisdom will stink in its very foolishness. What wore the face of power will prove itself the most miserable weakness. That is, what in us seems perfection itself corresponds ill to the purity of God. I mention these words, first of all, obviously, to highly recommend great literature and one of the greatest pieces of Christian literature ever written, obviously, is the Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin. This is the 1559 edition, the final Latin edition. There was one, I believe, one French edition after 1559. He died in 1564. But it was first written, again, before he was even 30 years of age. It was much smaller at that time. It was he expanded it a number of times during his ministry. But what is truly what has always amazed me as an author myself is how relevant the Institutes remains many, many hundreds of years after it was originally written. I've used the description that the ink still smudges on the Institutes. And that's a kind of writing that I'm not capable of doing. Most of us who write books are so ensconced in the context in which we are living and ministering that writing material that will be relevant 100 years after we're dead, 200 years after we're dead, will still breathe with life 500 years after we're dead. There are only a few people that can do that. So when I read these words, it doesn't matter what culture you're in. It really doesn't matter what language you speak. These words are just as relevant, just as meaningful to us today as when they were written. And of course, one of the things I deeply appreciate about John Calvin the man is that for all of the theological writing he did, what takes up the most shelf space, for those of you who've only grown up in the Logos era, shelf space is where we have paper books, and they have to be put on shelves. And I don't know how many feet of shelves I have in my office, but a few. These are shelves, see, and these are books. The vast majority of the material that takes up shelf space from John Calvin in my library are his biblical commentaries, which, I mean, the man preached. Most of us work hard to do a Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night each week. He preached every day for years on end with a 27-year headache. And when you recognize that the writings that he did on theology are absolutely immersed in biblical exegesis, and still some of the best biblical exegesis that you'll get. I mean, a lot of times today we look at the exegesis of centuries ago and you sort of go, well, we've sort of worked through this issue a little bit better. Now we have more information about this in the background. Still, Calvin's commentaries remain incredibly, incredibly useful. Very, very useful to us to this day. No one's going to be saying this about me 500 years from now. So you look at someone like this and you look at them in their context and what little they had resource-wise in comparison to what we have today, and yet what they produced. You can criticize him for all of his failings, but I just wonder how many of us would get anywhere near producing the quality and the timelessness of the materials that Calvin produced. I don't think there would be all that many that would be able to do so. And so I highly recommend to you the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Do they sometimes get a little deep? Yeah. I remember back in the late 80s, we actually had a study series at the old offices in the Institutes. Was it? And it must have been before I was riding a bike, obviously, if it was a Saturday morning. So when we got into the Trinity section, it gets pretty deep. There's no question about it. But trivia question for all of you Calvinists out there. Trivia question. And that is, What is the longest section in the Institutes? The longest section in the Institutes. Now, let's say the longest section in the 1559, the standard version that is used today. Many people would assume that, the first subject that Calvin addresses was something like predestination, election, reprobation, stuff like that. No. Even though he did move material around, rearranging it at points in time during the editing process and the various versions that came out. In that final version where he had things where he wanted them to be, the section on predestination election comes after the longest section of the Institutes, which of course is on prayer. Prayer is the longest, the section on prayer is the longest portion of the Institutes. Vast majority of the folks that I know of that are critics of John Calvin have either one of two things. Either they've never even read the Institutes, or when they did so in such a prejudiced fashion. There are a lot of scholars who detest John Calvin, and yet they have to admit the absolute genius that was demonstrated in his writings. There are a lot of people that absolutely detest Jonathan Edwards, and yet an examination of his writings again demonstrates an intellect of incomparable accomplishment and discipline and depth. I think one of the unsung heroes, again, he has his critics, but certainly someone else I would highly recommend to you is one of the great Princeton reformers, Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, B.B. Warfield. His materials, especially both on canon and on the Trinity, deeply influenced me, especially in my seminary years as well. And so I'll put it this way. I waste so much time. So people say, you're listening to books while riding bikes. Yeah, I know. But still, when I think of, what I have to invest my time in, it's such a waste in comparison to some of the incredibly deep material that is available to us today. And, before you ever switch on that television, ask yourself the question, what would you get more out of? And the only answer I think that you can give when you consider what's available to us in things like the Institutes and the Reformation and the Puritans and all that kind of stuff, you're going to get a whole lot more out of investing that time than almost anything that's on television anymore. When I think of the stuff that's going on out there, it's pretty amazing. So, just a couple sections from the beginning of the Institutes. There's lots and lots of others. In fact, if you give me just a second, I was looking at this. Seemed rather relevant in light of a topic that we're going to be going to at the end of the program. Just of quotations here. This is from I have elsewhere explained how Scripture reconciles the two notions that all are called to repentance and faith by outward preaching, yet that the spirit of repentance and faith is not given to all. And I'm skipping around. Hence it is clear the doctrine of salvation, which is said to be reserved solely and individually for the sons of the church, is falsely debased when presented as effectually profitable to all. Let this suffice the present. Although the voice of the gospel addresses all in general, yet the gift of faith is rare. Isaiah sets forth the cause that the arm of the Lord has not been revealed to all. If he had said that the gospel is maliciously and wickedly despised because many stubbornly refuse to hear it, perhaps this aspect of universal calling would have force. But it is not the prophet's intention to extenuate men's guilt when he teaches that the source of the blindness is that the Lord does not deign to reveal his arm to them. He only warns that, because faith is a special gift, the ears are beaten upon in vain with outward teaching. Now, I should like to know from these doctors whether preaching alone or faith makes God sons. Surely, when it is said in the first chapter of John, all who believe in the only begotten Son of God also become sons of God, no confused mass is placed there, but a special rank is given to believers who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And then later on, also in Book 3, by the way, this is chapter 24, the supreme judge then makes way for his predestination when he leaves in blindness those whom he has once condemned and deprived of participation in his light. Of the former effect, there are daily proofs as well as many proofs in Scripture. If the same sermon is preached, I just found this relevant to the last conversation we had 2 days ago. If the same sermon is preached, say, to 100 people, 20 receive it with ready obedience of faith, while the rest hold it valueless, or laugh, or hiss, or loathe it. If anyone should reply that this diversity arises out of their malice and perverseness, I still will not be satisfied, because the nature of the former would be occupied with the same malice if God did not correct it by his goodness. Therefore, we shall always be confused unless Paul's question comes to mind, who distinguishes you? 1 Corinthians 4:7. By this he means that some excel others not by their own virtue, but by God's grace alone. A significantly more compelling response to that question than was offered by the individual that we were reviewing at that time. So, Institutes to Christian Religion, something I would highly recommend to you all for its reading. Shifting gears, over and over again, we encounter the news story about another state, another judge normally, deciding that birth certificates should no longer list father and mother. Progenitor A, progenitor, and then last week, I forget which state it was, but I can pretty much guess it was either California, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, or New York. The ruling came down that you must now list same-sex couples on birth certificates if they are involved somehow with this mess that is the result of the immoral revolution, the immoral sexual revolution of the past 60 years. The beautiful words, father and mother, with all they represent, under direct assault. And it made me think, and I looked, I know it's in there. I scanned my library. I just didn't have time to scan it closely enough, but I even know what the book looks like. I can see it's the spine of it. And it's the same one I read junior or senior year in high school. I forget which one it was. So maybe it's just so faded that I can't see it anymore, it's so old. But it made me think of a portion of Huxley's Brave New World. And you've heard me mention a number of times that we are living in a day where prophetic predictions made either in 1984 or in Brave New World are being fulfilled in sort of a mixed fashion. And certainly this one is one that you see primarily in Brave New World. Right in the it's in the second chapter, so right toward the beginning of Brave New World. There are, if you haven't read Brave New World, hard to give you the background, but it's hundreds of years in the future. And mankind is now mass-produced, and genetically controlled. And as we see CRISPR technology being used, it's like Huxley had a crystal ball, because this is exactly what's happening. And it's going to happen unless, well, let's just hope I Am Legend doesn't turn out to be as prophetic as 1984 and Brave New World did. Because in case you haven't seen it, what's that? Or The Walking Dead. Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing. In I Am Legend, the disease that destroys the vast majority of humanity comes about through genetic manipulation and playing around with the human genome. And if you listen to the briefing, as I do every day that it's on, you know that this genetic manipulation is taking place right now. China, other places, they're talking about doing it here, where you're actually going to be modifying the stem cell line, that it can be heritable, it can be passed on, changing the human genome. It is absolutely frightening, not just because of scary sci-fi movies, but just because of the utter arrogance of mankind, and of the fact that this is taking place right at the greatest point of human hubris in history, where we have the least fear of God. Secular humanism, atheism, it's rampant all around us, even in religion. But this is now when these things are happening. And it's frightening to think about. But this is what's going on around us. And I thought back to this story in the Brave New World where the plot line is introduced right at the beginning about how mankind is being produced through the mechanism of a tour through the building, one of the buildings, where embryos are being conditioned to the various levels of society, the alphas, the betas, the gammas, the epsilons, deltas and epsilons. And epsilons are the lowest. They're semi-morons. They just, run elevators and dig ditches and things like that. And then, and this is all controlled in the development of these children in this totally artificial process. There are no fathers and mothers anymore. There's no family. Everybody belongs to everyone else. There's no and what's interesting is Huxley saw what this would result in for sexual morality. So let me just pick up. The director of the hatchery is taking a group of alphas, so a highest level, through and showing them things. I'm not sure why did you just get banned? Oh, you misspelled a word and did something bad. I just looked over and Rich my bot over on the computer in the other room just kicked Rich out and banned him. You actually spelling matters to that. Yes, you might want to. You could go unban yourself on the unit over there if you wanted to, but we won't talk more about that on the air. Here's the section from Brave New World that I was thinking of. We condition the masses to hate the country, concluded the director, but simultaneously we condition them to love all country sports. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport. Hence those electric shocks. I see, said the student, and was silent, lost in admiration. There was a silence, then clearing his throat, once upon a time, the director began, while our Ford was still on Earth, there was a little boy named Reuben Rabinovich. Reuben was the child of Polish-speaking parents. The director interrupted himself. You know what Polish is, I suppose? A dead language? Like French and German, added another student, obviously showing off his learning. And parent? Questioned the DHC. DHC, the director of the hatcheries. There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed. They had not yet learned to draw the significant but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. One, at last, had the courage to raise a hand. Human beings used to be... He hesitated and the blood rushed to his cheeks. Well, they used to be viviparous. Quite right, the director nodded approvingly. And when the babies were decanted, born, came the correction. Well, then they were parents. I mean, not the babies, of course, the other ones. The poor boy was overwhelmed with confusion. In brief, the director summed up, the parents were the father and the mother. The smut that was really science fell with a crash into the boy's eye-avoiding silence. Mother, he repeated loudly, rubbing in the science and leaning back in his chair. These, he said gravely, are unpleasant facts. I know it, but then most historical facts are unpleasant. It goes on to talk about, at a later point, just the revulsion at the idea of a family, of uniqueness, individuality. And of course, in this society, sexual morality is 180 what it was back then. You are considered evil if you do not have relationships with many, many, many people on a regular basis. That's the new sexual norm. Of course, there's no children. They're not to be. There's contraception, and of course, something called soma, a drug that allows you to always be calm and happy and satisfied with whatever lot you have in life. Total dehumanization, and if you know the story, what this results in at the end, feet moving along, back and forth along the compass. If you know the story, you know what I'm talking about. I don't know how. I don't have the ability to see trends like certain people do. I just don't. Schaefer saw trends and what they were going to result in long before you ever get to the fulfillment of these things. And Wells, Huxley, these others saw where these trends were going, and now we see them. We actually see these individuals in our society, and we try to warn, but it just seems, especially like the next generation has been conditioned to be willing to accept this kind of thinking and the utter destructiveness of humanity that results from it. And as I listened to this section, and then, like I said, just a little bit later, there is a section where one of the controllers joins the group and is talking about motherhood, my baby, and they're just responding, just going, oh, just the idea of motherhood. And we see people today that have not gotten to that fully to that point, but they highly denigrate the concept of motherhood. It's clearly a lesser thing than being a successful businesswoman or something along those lines. And you join this with the insanity the humanity denying insanity of gender rebellion. And it really gets to the point where you start seeing this, and you recognize that what Huxley was warning about was a complete dehumanization of the human race. Looks like he had it way too far down the road and didn't go nearly as far as our God is in the heavens and he rules and reigns, and we can hope and pray that there would never be a period of time in human history, anything similar to what you see in Brave New World. There would still be a church one way or the other if there was. It might be hidden out on an island someplace. There'd still be a church. Anyway, it just really struck me that we are hearing the fulfillment of these predictive voices. And we can look at the people, we can look in their faces and say, they want this. I'm not sure how many of them have read the books, but they want this. And it's a shocking thing to consider. It really, really is. Well, there's Brave New World and the motherhood issue that's going on. Next, I have a little bit of something for everybody here. A video was put out. We're shifting gears now. If any of you were tuning in for some more Calvinism stuff, that's at the end of the program. So I'm reeling you along to the end because I am aware of the Matt Walsh explosion, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. But first, this is volume 8. I've forgotten how many volumes there are. It takes up an entire row in my library. I had a man visit me once. Brilliant young man. Knowing that this young man is out there makes me all the more confident that ministry to Muslims is going to continue in the future, and that there are going to be people who do it right. They're going to do it in love. They're going to do it with an eye to the glory of God. They're not going to do it just to get their theological swords bloody. And if I get run over by a truck on my bike next week, that's going to continue on because God's building his kingdom. And like I said, I don't know how many times, if you ever get it in your mind that God's dependent upon you, you've lost it. You've missed it, and God's probably going to take you right out. I've told the story of a man. I remember a man, late 1980s. Man, he was well known. He had a big ministry, big voice, and then he got it in his head that he was really vitally important, and if you didn't support him, kingdom of God was going to come to a grinding halt. Well, almost nobody today even has a clue who the guy is. Almost nobody has even heard of him. God just simply, whoosh, wiped him right out of the way. And, God has the right to do that with anybody at any time. But if you want to hasten the process, get it into your mind that somehow God's dependent upon you. He ain't. He'll accomplish his purpose with or without you. This is the history of Al-Tabari. Top shelf in my Muslim section, you'll see a bunch of books like this. I just want to know what the last volume is. How many volumes are there? Could you look real quick? It's huge. The history of Al-Tabari is very, very large. And it is considered one of the most vitally important historical resources in Islamic history. So this is a Muslim source. It is considered to be a reliable, sound source of information concerning the events of Muhammad's life. There's all sorts of direct connections between what's found here and what you'll find in the Hadith, things like that. 34 volumes. Okay, it's big. It's a big set. This is the SUNY State University of New York paperback set. I would imagine the hardback set's a lot more expensive. Right at the beginning of volume 8, this Al-Tabari, Al-Tabari, Al-Tabari. This is the Michael Fishbein translation. Right at the beginning of volume 8, we have the, doing a lot of reading today, we have the following story. The messenger of God came to the house of Zayd bin Haritha. Zayd was always called Zayd bin Muhammad. Now, let me stop for a moment and give you the background there. Zayd was a slave freed by Muhammad and adopted by him. And that's why he says Zayd was always called Zayd bin Muhammad. Perhaps now, and Muhammad had presided over Zayd's marriage to Zayd's wife, Zaynab bint Jash, who was Muhammad's cousin. Continuing the reading, perhaps the messenger of God missed him at that moment so as to ask, "Where is Zayd?" He came to his residence to look for him, but did not find him. Zaynab bint Jash, Zayd's wife, rose to meet him. Because she was dressed only in a shift, the messenger of God turned away from her. She said, "He is not here, messenger of God. Come in, you who are as dear to me as my father and mother." The messenger of God refused to enter. Zaynab had dressed in haste when she was told the messenger of God is at the door. She jumped up in haste and excited the admiration of the messenger of God, so that he turned away murmuring something that could scarcely be understood. However, he did say overtly, "Glory be to God, the Almighty, glory be to God who causes hearts to turn." When Zayd came home, his wife told him that the messenger of God had come to his house. Zayd said, "Why didn't you ask him to come in?" She replied, "I asked him, but he refused." "Did you hear him say anything?" he asked. She replied, "As he turned away, I heard him say, 'Glory be to God the Almighty, glory be to God who causes hearts to turn.'" So Zayd left, and having come to the messenger of God, he said, "Messenger of God, I have heard that you came to my house. Why didn't you go in, you who are as dear to me as my father and mother? Messenger of God, perhaps Zaynab has excited your admiration, and so I will separate myself from her." The messenger of God said, "Keep your wife to yourself." Zayd could find no possible way to approach her after that day. He would come to the messenger of God and tell him so, but the messenger of God would say to him, "Keep your wife." Zayd separated from her and left her, and she became free. While the messenger of God was talking with Aisha, a fainting overcame him. This was, according to the sources, the standard experience of the reception of revelation by Muhammad. When he was released from it, he smiled and said, "Who will go to Zaynab and tell her the good news, saying that God has married her to me?" Then the messenger of God recited, "And when you said unto him on whom God has conferred favor, and you have conferred favor, keep your wife to yourself," and the entire passage. According to Aisha, who said, "I became very uneasy because of what we heard about her beauty, and another thing, the greatest and loftiest of matters, what God had done for her by giving her in marriage. I said that she would boast of it over us." According to Aisha, who said, "Salma, the maidservant of the messenger of God, went out to inform Zaynab." According to Yunus bin Abd Allah, Ibn Wahb ibn Zayd, who said, the messenger of God had married Zaynab bin Haritha to Zaynab bin Jash, his paternal aunt's daughter. One day the messenger of God went out looking for Zayd. Now there was a covering of haircloth over the doorway, but the wind had lifted the covering so that the doorway was uncovered. Zaynab was in her chamber undressed, and admiration for her entered the heart of the prophet. After that happened, she was made unattractive to the other man, which would be Zayd. So he came and said, Messenger of God, I want to separate myself from my companion. Muhammad asked, what is wrong? Has anything on her part disquieted you? No, my God, replied Zayd. Nothing she has done has disquieted me, Messenger of God, nor have I seen anything but good. The Messenger of God said to him, keep your wife to yourself and fear God. That is the meaning of the word of God. And when you said unto him on whom God has conferred favor, and you have conferred favor, keep your wife to yourself and fear God, and you did hide in your mind that which God was to bring to light, you did hide in your mind the thought that if he separates from himself from her, I will marry her. So there's two different stories, two different versions of the same story, recorded by Al-Tabari. Now these are Islamic sources. I didn't, this is not some Orientalist making up this story or anything along those lines. And the section that was, the section that was being, cited in the Qur'an is from Ayah 33. And what is fascinating to me, and again, I discussed this in my book on this subject. Here's Surah 33, Ayah 37. And remember, O Muhammad, when you said to the one on whom Allah bestowed favor, and you bestowed favor, keep your wife and fear Allah. While you concealed within yourself that which Allah is to disclose, and you feared the people, while Allah has more right that you fear him. So when Zayd had no longer any need for her, we married her to you in order that there not be upon the disbelievers any discomfort concerning the wives of their adopted sons when they no longer have need of them. And ever is the command of Allah accomplished. Okay, so there's your background. Surah 33, not only there, but elsewhere, likewise contains the necessary command that basically ended the practice of adoption in Islam. Now, you can still adopt a child, but that child is not considered your child. You're just a protector. Jewish adoption, Roman adoption, Christian adoption insisted, and adoption amongst the Arabs up until this time insisted that when you adopted a child, that child was the equal of any of your natural children in name, in inheritance, in standing in the family. It's a beautiful thing. Adoption is used in the New Testament as a picture, as it's one of the things that we utilize as a beautiful sign of our relationship to God. And what happened as a result of this incident. You see, amongst the Arabs, having that your son's wife, if there was a divorce, was haram to you. You could not marry her. It was considered incest. So the marriage to Zaynab in Arab tradition was incestuous. It was wrong. And that's why you have divine revelation. Even Aisha is quoted as being worried about her status as Muhammad's favorite wife because of the fact that divine revelation had to be given to provide the foundation for Muhammad and Zaynab to be married. What brought this up is I recently addressed this in the context of being falsely accused of having become a apologist for Muhammad and excusing his relationship with Aisha on the basis of the fact that I said that in the witnessing situation, it seems much wiser to me to approach the subject of Muhammad and his life from the perspective of something like this. You have specific canonic revelation that you can look at. And it also does not contain the same level of emotional gunpowder, I guess you might say, emotional dynamite. Because especially for Sunni Muslims, Aisha is considered to be the mother of the faithful. And so, it's like talking about Mary to a Roman Catholic that lives in Mexico. It's just, you're just begging for a punch in the nose pretty fast, And so certain individuals just, out of prejudice and so on and so forth, misrepresented what I was saying. And that's what brought this up. Well, those comments were picked up on in a video that was posted, I believe, yesterday. And I want to take a look at the video. And now that you have the background, you'll be able to understand better what the video is about, because it's fascinating. I believe, sorry if I got this wrong, I think Yahya Snow put this out. And what's interesting is it contrasts the statement that I made as soon as I got back from the trip that I took, where all this stuff exploded, where I had the dialogue with Yasser Qadhi. Yeah, it was Memphis and a number of other places. That was G3 and everything else. And the primary corrector of my comments about Zaynab that is included is Yasser Qadhi. So this gives us an opportunity to listen to a Muslim saying, well, I think you're wrong about Zaynab bin Jash. Here's Yasser Qadhi's take on it. And I just want us to listen to the whole thing, and then I'll respond to it. Because I hope this won't surprise Yahya, but I had seen Dr. Qadhi's comments on this a while ago. Don't remember how long ago it was, but I had already seen the comments. And it's not something that we've had the opportunity of discussing yet personally, but it would be an interesting place of discussion. Because, for me, you must understand, I'm saying this to my Muslim friends that are listening to this, I've got to ask you to try to step back from your traditions just long enough to try to hear what we're saying. Please keep in mind a few things that I've mentioned to you before, and I hope you can hear me again. I see no evidence. Let me just address this to Yahya, okay? You and I have crossed swords electronically many times. And I would like to see that end, not because either one of us compromises, but just because we try to be a little bit more sympathetic to hearing what the other one is saying without necessarily jumping on the immediate, most negative reading possible. And I did feel like, at least in this video, that's sort of what you were doing. So hopefully you'll take my response in the same way. You must understand that I am convinced, and I haven't had too many Muslims try to disabuse me of this conclusion, that the author of the Qur'an, and you know why I use the term author of the Qur'an. I'm trying to avoid pitfalls and diversions that take us into other areas to discuss possibilities of revision, compilation, all the rest of that stuff. Let's just leave that off to the side for a moment. I am convinced that the author of the Qur'an had no first-hand knowledge of the New Testament. Now, immediately, if you think the author of the Qur'an is Allah, you can't believe that. Okay, but I see no evidence of it. I see no evidence in the pages of the Qur'an of any kind of first-hand knowledge of what's found in the New Testament. It's representations of the Al-Injil, the people of the gospel. It's representations of what the New Testament allegedly talks about. It's mixture of Gnostic sources with Christian sources in regards to the life of Jesus. Those are all external examples of this. But the fact that there are so many times when the Quran attempts to address an issue, it assumes that its Christian audience knows the New Testament, but it doesn't show any evidence itself of knowing. For example, there's nothing in the Quran that even begins to show evidence of a knowledge of the argument of the book of Hebrews, for example. Just nothing. Of the real meaning of atonement, of any of that kind of stuff. It's just not there. If you can show me where it is, and most of the time the answer I get is, well, it doesn't need to be there. Well, then you're proving my point. And I see again in Surah 5, which is another area that I'd really like to have discussion with Dr. Qadi on, or someone along those lines. But I see in Surah 5 that chain in 44 through 50 something, where you go from Moses Torah to Jesus Injil to Muhammad Quran, and clearly the author is attempting to say this is a chain of authority, that God has been calling these prophets and giving these books. And yet when I look at the Tanakh, or as you would call it, the Torah, and then I look at the Injil, the reality is the New Testament writers have a deep and intimate knowledge of the Old Testament, quote from it constantly. You come to the Quran, what do you have? You have the lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You might have a quote from one of the Psalms, though that's disputable. That's it. You don't have any firsthand knowledge. You have stories, but those stories sound very much like they were transmitted orally, not in the sense of having a knowledge of what's actually contained in the text. And so what that's leading me to here in regards to Zaynab bin Jash is when I read Ayah 37 of Surah 33, there is such a vast contrast between the view of marriage found not only in the prophets of the Old Testament, but explicitly in the teaching of Jesus and his apostles, that it's really, really hard to even give consideration to the idea. So when Zayd had no longer any need for her, I can't believe that comes from God and Ephesians 5 comes from God, not at the same time. Jesus, his teaching on marriage, Matthew chapter 19. Can't put them together. We married her to you in order that there not be upon the believers any discomfort concerning the wives of their adopted sons when they no longer have need of them. This is just so, in my opinion, so far below biblical revelation of the nature of marriage that the two simply, they can't come from the same source. They can't come from the same source. There was no problem since it was considered incest. So it strikes me as special pleading. And it seems to me that we're not being unfair if we use Al-Tabari as a meaningful source for the history of this. And there seems to be real consistency between Al-Tabari's version and what we see in the Quran. So there's the issue. There's the issue. With that, I'm glad I looked over here and saw that I'd unplugged the sound. With that, what? Yes. With that, let's take a look at the video that was put out. And you ready to go with it? Here we go. But the reality is that I think it is a significantly less emotionally charged and yet weightier issue to address the fact that the Qur'an shows tremendous embarrassment about Zaynab bint Jash, not Aisha. So in other words, when you address the issue of Zaynab, wow, Allah felt it was necessary to reveal an entire portion of a surah in the Quran to excuse Muhammad's marrying of the divorced wife of his adopted son, and in the process destroyed the beautiful institution of adoption in Islam. I think that is a weighty argument. It doesn't immediately bring the emotional barriers and might actually be used to cause a person to sit back and to think about the prophethood of Muhammad. Adoption and sponsoring a child is allowed. What is not allowed is to consider the child exactly the same as the biological child. Well, yeah, that's the problem. That's not adoption.
And this is where we get in Islam the principle that adoption is never the same as a blood relation. You can adopt children. You can bring them into your family. You can take care of them. You can raise them. But they're never your child. They're always genetically different from you.
Okay, so I just stopped that right there. Okay, I understand that. But that's not adoption. That's like a foster relationship or whatever else it might be. Again, the position that had been held prior to this and that is represented in the Torah and Injil, in which are light and guidance. And I've never heard a Muslim saying that what those books said about adoption was wrong, or even try to mount an argument for it, because that's what Muhammad believed up to this point in time. So that's just a redefinition. That is a diminishment of adoption to a much lesser thing. Yes, sir?
I think the word that would best describe that would be guardianship.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. To address the fact that the Quran shows tremendous embarrassment about Zaynab bint Jash, not Aisha. So in other words, when you address the issue of Zaynab, wow, Allah felt it was necessary to reveal an entire portion of a surah in the Quran to excuse Muhammad's marrying of the divorced wife of his adopted son. This way this guy is spinning it is unacceptable. The Quran was revealed contemporaneous to Prophet Muhammad's life, and it refers to many things going on during his life, so the Quran referring to this isn't an issue. Let me respond to that. But if you're an Orthodox Sunni, you believe that this was written from eternity. That has implications. From my perspective, if this is a reliable source of information, can you see why I might go, wow, looks a little bit convenient to all of a sudden get to overthrow and redefine the meaning of adoption, as well as it shows a very, very sub-biblical view of marriage. I mean, these are the issues. And why do you need entire revelation at this point? Well, you had to, because this was considered an incestuous relationship. And so all of a sudden, Muhammad goes into the prophetic faint and receives word from Allah that he is to fear Allah and not men. And this has had tremendous impact societally in Islamic nations. That's just the reality. Before explaining the marriage of Zaynab, let's look at the Bible so this polemicist can be brought to consistency. According to the Bible, God interacts with events that go on during the lives of his prophets. I've picked the example of David, an example which secularized Christians may find uncomfortable. The intention here is to get polemicists thinking deeper and more consistently. Well, by the way, don't we have very different understandings of inspiration? We do believe that men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. But you don't believe that. The very deep and rich concept of revelation that we have, that God utilizes the exact vocabulary, personality of the individuals that he chooses to be the ones through which the scripture comes to us. And of course, the very fact that we have 40 different authors over 1,500 years speaking 3 different languages, well, 2 related languages and 1 very different language, is to me one of the evidences of the inspiration of scripture. It allows all sorts of objections to be raised, but you're talking about a monolingual, mono-authored work in the Qur'an. And we're talking about how you can get a collection of books written over 1,500 years, and yet you have the same themes and truths woven through all of these from beginning to end. That to me is a place where the Bible is on a completely different plane, completely different level than the Qur'an. It makes it harder to defend, but it also makes it much deeper as well. So anyway, we press forward here. I'm not sure how long this stays up. Is it moving? Yes, it's moving. Just looking at the little. That's a 2 foot. Well, you remember at one point in the past, I criticized these folks for not leaving it up long enough so no one could read it. So now I think they sit there and read it and make sure that you can get all the way through it. So that's good. That of course you can just.
2 Samuel 12:11-12. God uses as a punishment for David's sin with Bathsheba by decreeing, "Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight."
Primary modes of attack.
Okay, well, back up. That's Yasser. So in 2 Samuel chapter 12, because of David's sin, and may I point out, because of the degradation of marriage that took place. According to Jesus, it was God's intention from the start that it be one man and one woman. There was a step down into polygamy seen in Abraham, David. You see the results in Solomon's life. And of course, I just point out to the Christians listening, Muslims don't believe that any of the prophets were great sinners. Some believe they didn't sin at all. What the level of sin is sometimes varies from individual to individual. But for example, with what happened in Solomon, they would never accept that was true. Because from their perspective, the personal character of the prophet is determinative of his ability to be the channel through which divine revelation would be given. And of course, we don't have that concept. That's an anachronism for us. It comes at a later point in time. So David, we know what happens with Absalom. David is punished. I'm not sure what this has to do with this situation, because A, the Muslim doesn't believe that these incidents took place in David's life as far as there being any need for punishment for him in regards to Bathsheba. B, historically, this took place in the rebellion of Absalom. So what does this have to do with divine revelation having to come down so that Muhammad can be married to his cousin? I missed it. Sorry, don't get what the challenge is there. But it immediately goes on to some comments made by Yasser Khadi. So let's listen to what Yasser had to say.
Wives in broad daylight.
Primary modes of attack. I wanted to conclude by giving some examples, some lengthy examples. We only have 10 minutes. I'll try to summarize them. The first example, and by the way, I've given 3 tactics. I'm not being exclusive. These are the primary 3 tactics. Also, most of the time, an attack against the honor of our Prophet ﷺ is a combination of these 3. It's not that only one is used. A story is invented, bits of fabrication, bits of distorted truths, bits of cultural values, and then presented. And so an example of this, one example, in a little bit of detail. The story of Zaynab bint Jash and the Prophet ﷺ's marriage to Zaynab. Now, Zaynab bint Jash was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and she was married to Zayd. And Zayd radiallahu anh, was the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ. As you all know, he had adopted Zayd. And so he was called Zayd ibn Muhammad. And just like in our culture, American culture, adopted children and biological children are considered the same. Morally, I'm saying. Morally. If you try to say, no, there's a difference, morally society will say, oh, you're being so mean, you're being so unfair. Cultural values, once again. Islamically, in the beginning period of Islam, it was the same. Adopted children.
Now, did you catch that? Here's Dr. Qadi, and he rightly recognizes that there was a radical change because of Surah 33 and because of Zaynab bin Jash. Now, I just go, what prompted this? Is it more likely that God said, that's a real problem they're having with this adoption thing. Real problem that they're having because just so many dads want to marry the divorced wives of their adopted sons. That was really a problem? Of all the issues that were facing the Ummah at that time, this was a pressing problem? I'm sorry, I don't see it. I don't see it.
Biological children are the same. And so when the Prophet ﷺ adopted Zayd, his name became Zayd ibn Muhammad. And the wife of Zayd, i.e. Zaynab, became the daughter-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ. And as you all know, daughter-in-laws are permanent mahram. Even if the marriage breaks between the son and the wife, the father-in-law always remains a mahram. This is a strange thing, subhanAllah. The husband becomes a non-mahram after the divorce. The husband becomes a non-mahram because after the divorce is over, but the father-in-law remains a mahram forever. So, in this case...
Just in case you're wondering, mahram, in Semitic languages, if you hear mahram, you hear haram, forbidden, and almost always when a M sound is at the beginning, you've turned it into a substantival participle. So, shirk is the sin of association. A mushrik is a person who commits that. Mushrikun are plural, the idolaters. And so what he's talking about there is the fact that divorce changes some of these relationships, but not others. The father-in-law stays a mahram, was what he was saying there. Sometimes Dr. Qadi speaks very, very quickly. When I listened to his series Light and Guidance, I don't think I listened to that one at high speed because it would have been, no, it was a little bit too fast.
When Zayd and Zaynab were married, the Prophet ﷺ eventually ended up marrying Zaynab. What is the Orientalist version? The Orientalists all agree. There is pretty much ijma', unanimous consensus amongst them, that the version of events goes as follows. The Prophet ﷺ allegedly fell in love with Zaynab. He went to visit her in her house, and she opened the door, and she was wearing clothes that typically she would wear when she's sleeping. In other words, not fully dressed up, and that the Prophet ﷺ saw her beauty and was impressed by that and fell in love with her. And when Zayd heard about this, then he divorced his wife so that the Prophet ﷺ could marry her. And Allah Azza wa Jal conveniently revealed, according to them, verses that talk about adopted children are not real children and you can marry their wives. This is the non-Muslim version of events, that the Prophet ﷺ, a'udhu billah, saw Zaynab dressed inappropriately, fell in love with her at first sight, and wanted to marry her, so he concocted these verses to say that adopted children are not biological children. The problem with this sequence of events is that it is presented as undisputed fact from within the Islamic tradition. It's as if this is the only version of events. Yet the fact of the matter is that this version is only one version of the story. And let us call this, for lack of a better term, the love story version. There are other versions that exist in classical and medieval texts which are generally considered more acceptable and more authentic. In fact, Sahih al-Bukhari, Tafsir ibn Kathir, or the Sirah ibn Ishaq, all of the standard references present a very different picture. Before we get into who's right and wrong, don't you think it's hypocritical for a non-Muslim to come and pounce on the most sensationalist story and ignore all the other versions and then not even tell you the other versions exist? Not even question the fact that there are other versions of the story? Let me give...
Now, I would have to respond by saying, well, why did Al-Tabari do that? I mean, I don't think it requires prejudice or something. The sources that Al-Tabari relied upon communicated to him from multiple streams that story, which is consistent, and it's not a matter of pouncing upon something. This is a vitally important subject that's raised in the text of the Qur'an itself. And it's the Qur'an that gives the answer, the statement that, hey, this is so there wouldn't be trouble concerning this issue, when it's really hard for most of us to go, there wasn't any trouble. Where's the evidence that there was trouble? Where's the evidence that the Ummah was just torn apart because all these fathers wanted to marry the divorced daughters of their adopted sons? That raises some serious questions.
For example, the earliest tafsirs written, Tafsir of Abdul Razak in 211, Tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim in 327, the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, the earliest Sirah books written, Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, the earliest Hadith books written, the Hadith of the Sahih of Imam Bukhari. All of these books give a radically different story. What is the story there? The story there is that the Prophet ﷺ was informed by Allah that eventually Zaynab would be his wife. And Zayd and Zaynab began having arguments and disputes.
Okay, now let me just stop right there. And again, to Yahya. Okay, let's say that all of that stuff is true. Okay, that Ibn Kathir and Bukhari don't give the background information that Al-Tabari does. Okay. Do you see why we still have a major problem here? Because what's being said now is Muhammad was given a almost prophetic knowledge that he would be married to the wife of his son, his adopted son. All of the issues regarding the nature of marriage, all the issues of what the prophets of Israel said, all the issues of what Jesus said about marriage are still just as much a part of this as they were before. Whether Muhammad just simply fell for her or didn't fall for her, that element of it, the discontinuity that exists between Torah, Injil, and Qur'an, remains one way or the other in this situation.
Not want to remain married to Zaynab. So Zayd came to the Prophet ﷺ wanting a divorce. And the Prophet ﷺ felt awkward because he knew that when that divorce takes place and the iddah is over, Zaynab would become his wife, and he himself did not like the cultural taboo of marrying a supposed daughter-in-law. So he told Zayd, ittaqillah, fear Allah and don't divorce her. He told Zayd not to divorce her, and he feared men's criticism of this cultural taboo. Not that he had love of Zaynab. Rather, he was embarrassed at marrying a supposed daughter-in-law. So he wanted to stall it. Zayd wanted a divorce. This is the version of Sahih Bukhari. And the Prophet says, no, you stay with her. Don't divorce her. And Allah Azza wa Jal then revealed verses in Surah Ahzab. Why were you scared of the people? The Prophet says, this is a verse in the Quran. Why were you scared of the people? وَتَخْشَى النَّاسِ. It is more befitting that you are scared of Allah. Shouldn't be embarrassed at the people's statements. There is no love story in Sahih Bukhari, in Ibn Kathir, and all of these books. The question arises, where does this love story exist? Response, again we're getting a little bit academic here, but it exists in a tafsir called Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. And Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, by unanimous consensus, is not a scholar. He's not a historian. He is a storyteller. He is a storyteller. In other words, he's a tabloid paper. He's not the New York Times. Literally, he's a tabloid paper. So the Orientalists, imagine, and I said this at an academic conference when I was defending the story in a certain context. I said, imagine walking into a bookstore, walking into a supermarket, and ignoring the New York Times, ignoring, the Washington Post, ignoring every single reputable, the Times Magazine, Newsweek, and getting your news from the Daily Inquirer, for example. This is the equivalent of what these people are doing. They ignore every single authentic, legitimate book, and they go to the most obscure references. How many of you have even heard of Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman? Yes, it exists. It's not a fabrication, meaning the book is not a fabrication. What's inside it might be. But the book itself, it exists. How many of you are aware of it? Nobody. But these guys hunt down these stories, extract them, and popularize them. So this is one example. There are many other examples as well, which we don't have time to get.
Okay, that's where the video ended. There wasn't any application made outside of that. So my assumption is that what Yahya is saying is, well, there's an answer. I just may have destroyed my earbud there. That there's an answer. Well, okay, there is an answer from Yasser Khadi on the issue of Muhammad falling for Zaynab. And so you can choose to think that Al-Tabari just was using bad sources or whatever else it might be. Okay, doesn't change the fundamental problem that the Revelation, Surah 33, destroyed real adoption, redefined it to something much less, and that it stands in sharp contrast to the teachings of the prophets and of the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And so, which is more consistent with this odd revelation about a problem that really didn't exist? Al-Tabari's version or the version of Ibn Kathir or something like that? And why would there be the addition of embarrassing information in the sources used by Al-Tabari that's not in the others? These are questions that should be looked at and considered, I think, seriously. But there you go. Interacted with the video, and I think in a fair manner. I thank Yahya for posting it. I'm glad we had opportunity to listen to Yasser Khadi. I don't think Yasser Khadi is going to be at all shocked that we have a disagreement here, and it would be a subject well worth discussion in the future between he and I about Surah 33 and about marriage and Christianity and Islam, and it would be I think a good thing. I'd love to be able to explain to a Muslim audience how central monogamous marriage is in the revelation of the New Testament, even in the fact that the scriptures liken the relationship of the Lord Jesus to his church as husband and wife. We're called the bride of Christ, and all the things that would involve, which I don't think can be said of the Islamic understanding of the relationship of Allah to the Ummah. And very fertile areas of discussion that unfortunately don't always get discussed. But now we've had the opportunity of opening up that discussion. So there you go. All right. Wow, has it been an hour and 24 minutes since we started? I'm sorry. Well, I get these topics. I know I'm gonna be gone for a while. So are you gonna try to get some folks to sit in while I'm in South Africa, London? Hadn't really given it much thought. Just rebuild everything? In here, you mean? No, you're not. I can tell you're not. No, you're not. Okay. One last thing to get to as far as the topics I wanted to get to today, and I won't spend too much time on this, to be perfectly honest with you, because we just don't have that much time left. But I was just asked in channel, do you experience life at 1.4 times speed? My experience is the older you get, that number keeps going up and up and up. and time goes faster and faster and faster. Yes, it is an odd and strange reality of experience. I'm sending you different video this time. This is the one you're going to have to play with to get it to look semi-decent. I don't know exactly why Leighton Flowers chose to do what he did, but he did a live yet stop and start response to a nearly 3-hour-long dividing line. And I have not listened to the vast majority of it, but some poor guy in channel who wants to be known as the troublemaker from Iowa, because we have the troublemaker from Texas, and now we have the troublemaker from Iowa. He did listen to it, and I'm like, why would anyone do that? I mean, I know this is Leighton's day job. It's his day job to respond to me. That's what certain powers that be in Texas want done. But I can't bring myself to invest the time. I've got so much coming up. We've got a discussion on Roman Catholicism in South Africa. Bashir Varnia and I are going to debate on the crucifixion, I think, at the mosque in Lenasia. And I guess I can go ahead and announce this now. The 17th, he says, as he looks for his icon with the calendar on it. March 17th. Oh, look at that. It's St. Patty's Day. Who cares? On March 17th, in London, once again, same location as last year, Kensington Temple, where I'll also be speaking on Sunday evening on the reliability of Scripture. But 17th, I believe 7 o'clock. I'll have to double check this with the folks there at Kensington Temple. Abdullah Al-Andalusi and I will be having a debate/dialogue. Now, why do I say it? Well, what we're working on is a topic that we both recognize would actually... I tried to do it once before with someone else in a debate format. Didn't work. Just didn't work. But it is probably the most important topic that Christians and Muslims could discuss. And so we're going to be discussing it. And the folks at Kensington Temple were just fantastic last time in promoting it. It was live streamed really clearly. The venue is perfect. Centrally located. I mean, just it was just one of the best debates we've had. The only thing I'm going to be missing is guess who's not going to be there to take hundreds and hundreds of pictures, but Mike and Kathy. I really maybe the folks at Kensington might be able to get somebody to. Yeah, do you have any budding photographers you'd like to? Because it was really, really nice to have those pictures right afterwards. Because the lighting's perfect. It's just really works out really well. But Abdullah Al-Andalusi, he and I have debated in the past. He's pretty well known there in London. I think Abdullah would confess that we've always had a cordial relationship, even in our disagreements. Never been. Abdullah and I haven't crossed swords in the way that I have with Yahya, for example. And Abdullah is a very well-read young man, and I think he'll be an excellent representative of his side. And so I'd like to ask people to start praying right now for those events, for those debates, both in South Africa as well as in London. And that there would be not only peace, protection from any violence or any disruption, but that there would especially be, like well, what we experienced after the encounters in Memphis, I would really, and I think Abdullah would agree with this, I think if we saw the Muslims and Christians talking with one another after these events, instead of being in groups by themselves, separated from one another, my hope is that there will be much more interaction. In other words, that the discussion that we'll have on this subject will lead to, but when we get done, that won't be the end of the discussion. It'll be continuing on from there, except it'll be the people who've been watching who will then continue that, and that would be excellent. That would be the way that it needs to be. So that's coming up, and really excited about teaching at Potchefstroom. It used to be the old Potchefstroom University. Now it's Northwest University in Potchefstroom. Potchefstroom is a fun word to say repeatedly, and it's great to try to get it to rhyme with other words and things like that. But I'll be seeing Rudolph Bushoff coming up here really quick. Poor Rudolph. He has to put up with me every time I come down there. He's probably starting after this many years, starting to wonder why he ever did this. But hey, he set it all up, and he's the South African Energizer Bunny when it comes to doing this kind of stuff. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing him and Bashir and Ahmed Pandor and all the folks down there in South Africa. Won't be going to Pretoria, Cape Town, or Durban this trip. We'll definitely try to get back to those places in future visits. But I'm having the opportunity to actually teach at Northwest University during the days, regular class, and that's why it all worked out for March earlier in the year, things like that. So that's what's coming up at that time. So having said that, will those debates be live streamed? Not the ones in South Africa, no. But the one in London will be with Abdullah Al-Andalusi, who, by the way, is, I think, the snappiest dresser of all of the Muslim apologists I've dealt with in London. He definitely, Sami Zaatari wore that leather jacket that sort of made him look like a greaser out of the 1950s at one time. I think that was what he was going for. I think he might have a secret fascination with what was the movie? Grease. But what was his name? Yeah, I know it's John Travolta, but whatever the guy was, you never actually watched it. You saw no point in ever having watched Grease. So you cannot communicate with this culture at all. Well, okay, you can communicate with the millennials, but anybody before that, you have, okay, got it, fine, whatever. Just a little cultural problem there. Anyway, one last thing to get to. Danny, thank you. I knew it'd come up on screen. Danny, I think he wants to be, Sammy, you want to be Danny. I think that's what's going on there. Danny Zuko. Yeah, Danny Zuko. There you go. All right, let's get back to the subject here and get this over with. You disrupted me at that point. That was all a rabbit trail of your own making. I think you did. I'm sorry. I think you did. Back to Leighton Flowers. Let me put it this way. Some of you saw the explosion of tweets that happened, I think. Well, which night was it? I think it was the night before last. From Matt Walsh. Now, Matt Walsh is a conservative Roman Catholic commentator on cultural issues. And he writes a lot of good stuff. He's a good writer. He's pretty fearless, but he's a Roman Catholic. And as I've said so many times before, I will listen to Roman Catholics like Patrick Madrid. Well, Trent Horn. Trent Horn is deeply involved in pro-life issues in the United States. Kudos to him for that. I'll listen to these folks, and I'll be tracking with them, and we'll be agreeing right up to where the gospel comes in. And then it's all of a sudden they're quoting some vision of some saint and trying to pray to Mary to save the United States and Russia and all sorts of weird stuff like that. And off we go, because we don't have unity in the faith, because we don't have the same gospel. And so when I started seeing these tweets from Matt Walsh just going Dave Hunt on us, evidently someone described him as a cage stage Calvinist, had tweeted to Matt Walsh about God's predestining someone to heaven or something like that, and he just went at it. Well, that shouldn't surprise us. Once again, those who deny the decree of God, deny the sovereignty of God, not just simply in choosing to save, but to actually save. Hey, synergists of a feather flock together, that's shouldn't really be overly surprising. There was an article on Huffington Post that was basically, the title is Neo-Calvinism, the Non-Elect and Planned Parenthood, a Grand Kind of Farce. A grand kind of farce. And here is the paragraph I wanted to add in here. Neo-Calvinists, I believe rightly, cite God's justice and human dignity as the basis for opposing abortion on demand, all while wrongly believing in a God who arbitrarily selects the vast majority of humanity before they are born or do anything, who are all precious little babies at some point with inherent human dignity and all that, to be tormented forever in hell. That's their ultimate purpose as far as God's concerned, to languish in the eternal concentration camp, all to the praise of his glory. Now, this is a fellow by the name of Zach Hogue. That's him writing there. And once I can get the advertise on the screen, that was updated November. It was posted November 4th, 2016. I believe Phoebe actually posted that in response, because I guess Zach Hogue went after Summer. And so that's a roundabout way of why I ended up seeing this statement. Now, we hear a lot of this, and this is the very essence of the Leighton Flowers rhetoric as well. And I want to point this out and then play a section that absolutely demonstrates my point for me from Leighton Flowers' video. Sort of video. I mean, if you call holding an iPhone up to a computer screen a video, I guess that's what it was. I have explained this issue many times before, but I want to expand on part of that explanation. Biblical revelation is not two-dimensional. It is not a simplistic words on a piece of paper, 2 dimensions type of a thing. It has depth. There are threads of divine truth and themes that are introduced earlier in Revelation that sort of seem to disappear and then come out, and when they're joined with another thread of revelation, the hue and color is changed by its connection with that new part of revelation, that new element of revelation. So it takes on a deeper meaning. I've likened it to the beauty of the diamond. You can take a picture of a diamond from one perspective, but it can never capture the beauty of the diamond, because the diamond's beauty is not only on the surface level, it's internal, it's three-dimensional. And you would never, ever understand why a diamond is considered to be so precious by mankind if you didn't understand that the diamond was something more than what you just saw on a computer screen in one dimension, just from one perspective, or on a piece of paper in a picture. So I've talked about this many times, and I've said that one of the tactics of anti-reformed individuals is to try to flatten out what we're saying into a simplistic, well, it's what Zach Hogue did right here. He's completely ignoring the importance and reality of human existence in time. The scriptures talk about this fascinating, interesting concept of mankind acting in the decree of God. We're not denying there's a decree of God. But how mankind acts in his life and how God works through those actions is demonstrating God's wisdom, God's power, God's grace. And I've pointed out that if you try to take human experience in time and turn it into nothing, well, it doesn't matter because there's a divine decree and everybody, they're just going to hell anyways, and as far as God's concerned, that's their ultimate purpose. And because there is an acknowledgement that God has an ultimate purpose, anything that comes before that, irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. You can get rid of it. That's what Zach Hogue did. That's what Matt Walsh did. That's what Leighton Flowers does. And here's the problem with that. Jesus entered into what they throw out. Now you're starting to understand what I've been trying to communicate when I say the incarnation of Jesus Christ is the ultimate refutation of those who try to say that what happens in time, that we as Christians, that we as Reformed people are just teaching an idea of a puppet master. Jesus didn't become a puppet, but he became like his brother in all things. So guess what? His brethren aren't puppets either. So if you accept and use the puppet analogy, then you don't understand what we're talking about. You're not even arguing against what we're talking about. And that's also why God can hold men accountable for acting upon the desires of their hearts, because that's the realm of judgment, not any other realm. All of these people try to pretend that we should base our actions and time upon a knowledge of God's eternal decree, which he does not give to us. Which he does not give to us. And there's the error. All they want is the picture of the diamond from the top. They don't want to look at anything else. They don't want to see if there's anything else. And we say there's a whole lot more. We say there's a whole lot more. And this comes out really clearly in this portion. And again, I appreciate the troublemaker in Iowa's taking the time, because I wasn't going to listen to this, and so he gave me the time index. So I was able to just go straight to it and then didn't have to waste the rest of my life. But here's an example from Leighton Flowers. And let's just listen in. Here's the next thing we got to get to. The lost person made a bad decision. You know what's missing? You know what's missing in Leighton Flowers' understanding of sinners? Rebellion. The sinfulness of sin. I cannot imagine he ever got much use out of the Valley of Vision. I can't imagine he ever found the Puritans overly interesting to read. Because what's missing in Leighton Flowers, and he's got enough stuff out there now that you can check, is the sinfulness of sin. Is man's love of sin, man's love of rebellion.
All he's saying is the determinative nature of sin. In other words, sin itself determines, the desire for sin determines everything you do. And God ultimately has decreed for you to be born with that sinful desire. And
No, you missed it. You are deaf to what I'm saying. Everybody else in the audience heard it, but you, Leighton. Wow. That's not what I'm saying. How could you hear that? You are so focused on the task that's been given to you by you-know-who that you can't even hear what I'm saying. That's the exact opposite of what I was saying. I was talking about the sinfulness of sin. I'm talking about its moral, its rebellious, its depraved, its filthy aspect. And you go back off onto something else. No.
Cannot do otherwise unless he gives you a new nature, new heart, and then you can. And then you will, in fact, not that you just can. He doesn't just enable you to do it. He actually causes you to want to do it. And so he's just arguing for pure hard determinism. He just puts it in, different language.
The unholiness of mankind, his rejection of holiness, his rejection of what is good, his perversion of what is good. All you see man presented as made a bad choice. You mean he followed his heart?
Right. So what I'm trying to do is blame man for his actual choice, whereas your systematic is putting that back onto God.
See, he cannot hear what I'm saying, can he? I can't see any other elements. I got to squish it back down. It's just because you're saying God has a decree, so it's all about God, and God can't use any means, and there can't be anything to the sinfulness of sin. There can't be anything. No. It's just, this is anti-Calvinist derangement syndrome. It really is. It's frightening. It's scary.
Because he was decreed before time began to be born in a condition where he couldn't do otherwise. So I'm putting the blame back onto the creature and taking it off of God. Thus, that's one of the reasons I've made that case that a defense of free will is a defense of holiness. A defense of autonomous free will is a defense of God's character and his holiness. And a lot of people don't recognize that because they're not understanding that we're not trying to argue for man's great or something, that man's wonderful and should be worshipped. No, we're saying man's actually worse than the Calvinists think he is, because they're not rejecting a God who's already rejected them. They're rejecting a God who's provided for them and loves them. Which is worse? A rebellious teenager who's rebelling against his parents, who are drug dealers and abusers and haters and mean and ugly and nasty, or a teenager who rebels against loving, kind, gracious parents who provides for them? Obviously, the one who's rebelling against the parents that are good.
So God's a drug dealer in Calvinism, I guess. Totally missing the point completely. I was noticing people on Twitter going, "Wow, Leighton Flowers completely missed the point." Now, as we're listening, you can see, yep, not even on the planet.
What's what we're saying? We're saying these rebellious people are rebelling against a God who loves and provides for these people. That's how bad they are. Men in our system are 10 times, 1,000 times worse than in the Calvinistic system, because in the Calvinistic system, the poor reprobate is just a victim of God's decree. He's born in a condition where he can't do anything about it.
The poor reprobate, he's just a victim of God's decree. This man says he's a former Calvinist. Wow. Okay. All right. This is so misrepresentation. It's so straw man that you just, someone just said in channel, they don't desire understanding. They're just, this is raw meat for their own people. This is to keep the already rejecting. There's nothing more than that. I get it, but it's still sad to listen to.
He's hated salvifically, rejected.
And by the way, this hated salvifically, please. And I haven't even gotten to the main point yet. So hold on a second.
Maker. And you feel sorry for the reprobate of the Calvinistic worldview.
Oh, yeah.
You don't actually see them as all that bad, because hey, they couldn't do anything else. The guy.
So he's, in other words, you hear what he's doing? He's proving the very point that I was talking about at this point. I was saying he doesn't see the sinfulness of sin. He doesn't recognize that. And what does he do in his commentary? Give further evidence of exactly what I was saying. It's amazing.
Them to demonstrate his glory and his power through their reprobation. So you just feel sorry for them is all.
In continuing in his rebellion against God, he spit in the face of God.
Okay, which is worse, spitting in the face of a God who hates you and has condemned you to suffer for eternity in hell before you were ever born, or spitting in the face...
Now remember, what quote-unquote reprobate person, and we don't know who they are in this life, remember, has knowledge of this? None. The whole argument is so fallacious and so absurd that it's shocking to me. This is what's being taught to Southern Baptist Seminary students in these schools. Really? Wow.
God who loved and died in your place because he didn't want you to be condemned, and he wants to save you. Which is worse? Your view of man is way too high, Dr. White.
His detestation for the one who gives him everything.
There we go.
The lost man in Leighton Flowers.
Whoa, gives him everything.
Listen to this.
In Calvinism, he didn't give him everything. He didn't give the reprobate jack squat. He didn't die for him. He didn't love him. He didn't grant him faith or the ability thereof. He gave him breath for 80 to 90 years so as to suffer for the rest of eternity in hell. That's what he gave him. There's nothing that God, quote unquote, gave to the reprobate of your worldview. In our worldview, however, God gave all men the grace sufficient for them to respond. And therefore, when they don't, it's their own bad decision. I blame their bad decision. I blame their choices. I don't blame God's.
So God gave nothing. God gave nothing to these individuals. Nothing at all. No common grace. But we do have the assertion of prevenient grace, didn't we? Did you catch that? However, God gave all men the grace sufficient for them to respond. There's your prevenient grace. You may not call it that, but there's your prevenient grace. But from their perspective, but from the Calvinist perspective, he's given them. You heard what he said. I won't repeat it. So what's the foundation of all this? You ignore the drama of redemption. You ignore the fact that the incarnation proves that what happens in time is important to God. The means are important. All of this, you throw all that out. Who cares? In the final analysis, I'm going to ignore everything the Bible says about this. In the final analysis, if God's made the decision, then nothing else matters. Squish it all down. That's all they can do. That's all they can do. And the result, if they stay consistent with this, can never remain orthodox. If they see what happens, and if you keep pushing them, they just keep becoming more and more radical against biblical truth, and the result can be very troubling. So you expect this from Matt Walsh. You expect this from the consistent synergist, and you see what we're getting from the quote unquote misnomered Southern Baptist traditionalists as well. Denial of common grace, assertion of prevenient grace, that ever proving the existence of said thing. And then this, again, just utter inability to hear what is being said. That the fact that man's sin is an offense, a stench in the nostrils of God, doesn't even figure. They just made a bad choice. Given sufficient grace, made a bad choice. There you go. But that's all I'm interested in. As I read through the, and there's other things in the statement, obvious. In how long was this thing, anyways? 1 hour and 52 minutes. So yeah, I'm glad that I only had to listen to a very, very small portion of it. So, wow, look at that. Coming up on 3 p.m. Our time. So right at mega size. I was gonna go shorter. I thought I could do it in an hour. Maybe a jumbo, but oh well. Anyways, thanks for watching The Dividing Line. We should be here, Lord willing, at some point next week. I get back on Tuesday, so we might be able to do a program on Tuesday. We'll see. I'm speaking in Southern California at the TMAI Symposium, which is before the Shepherds Conference, but back on Tuesday. We'll see. We'll let you know. Thanks for listening. God bless.